Around 1345 BC, in a city built from nothing in the Egyptian desert, someone composed a hymn to the sun. Centuries later, in another land, a Hebrew poet wrote Psalm 104. Read them side by side, and something strange happens. The lions who hunt at night, the ships on the sea, the birds nesting in the branches, the same images, sometimes in nearly the same order. The internet has an easy answer. The Bible copied Egypt. Tonight, we are not going to tell you that, because the real story, the one Egyptologists and biblical scholars have argued over for a century, is stranger than plagiarism. It involves a pharaoh who erased the gods, a city abandoned in a single generation, and a poem that somehow refused to die. Let the texts speak first. Chapter 1. The Claim. If you have spent any time in the corners of the internet where religion and history collide, you have probably seen it. A split screen. On the left, lines from something called the Great Hymn to the Aten. On the right, verses from Psalm 104. The matching phrases are highlighted in yellow. The caption usually says something like, "The Bible plagiarized this Egyptian poem, and the churches do not want you to know." The post gets shared a few 100,000 times. Someone in the comments says this destroyed their faith. Someone else says it is all lies. Almost nobody in the thread has read either text from beginning to end. Here is what makes this claim different from most viral history. And this is important. It is not entirely made up. You may have encountered other Egypt, copied it claims online. The most famous is the one that says Jesus was assembled from the Egyptian god Horus, complete with a virgin birth and 12 disciples. That claim collapses the moment you open an actual ancient source, because the parallels simply are not in the Egyptian texts. This case is different. The parallels between the Great Hymn to the Aten and Psalm 104 are real. They are printed in standard academic anthologies. They are discussed in mainstream biblical commentaries. They have been part of serious scholarship for more than a century. The man who put this comparison on the map was not a conspiracy blogger. He was James Henry Breasted, the first American to earn a doctorate in Egyptology, founder of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, and one of the most respected figures in the field. Breasted translated the hymn and set it beside the psalm, and what he saw would occupy him for the rest of his career. In his 1933 book, The Dawn of Conscience, he argued that the resemblance was too close to be an accident. Coming from a scholar of his standing, the observation could not be dismissed. It has been argued over ever since. So the internet did not invent the comparison. What the internet did was flatten it. It took a century of careful, contested, genuinely unresolved scholarship and compressed it into one word: plagiarized. And this is where the word plagiarism begins to run into trouble. Think about what the word actually requires. It requires access. A writer has to be able to see, or hear, or somehow receive the text being copied. And we have to be able to point at how that is a demanding standard. And in this case, nobody has met it. The fullest surviving version of the Great Hymn is not a text we find in libraries, on papyri, in schoolboy copies, or, in quotations, by later writers, so far as the record preserves it. That version comes down to us from one place. It is carved on the wall of a tomb, in a city that was abandoned within about a generation of the hymn being written. a city whose founder had his name hacked off the monuments by the kings who came after him. The tomb was cut into desert cliffs. The hymn sat there, in the dark, until European scholars copied the inscriptions in the late 1800s, and the epigrapher Norman de Garis Davies published careful facsimiles of them in the early 1900s. Meanwhile, Psalm 104 was composed in Hebrew, in a different land, and almost certainly centuries later. Scholars argue about exactly when, and we will get into that argument, because it matters. But every serious proposal leaves a gap of centuries and hundreds of miles between the two poems. So the puzzle is not, did somebody copy? Nobody can demonstrate that. The puzzle is stranger. How do two poems separated by centuries, written in different languages, addressed to different gods, end up describing the world in images so similar that a hard-headed scholar like Breasted assumed there had to be a connection? That is a genuinely open question, and unlike most viral history claims, this one has serious people on every side of it. Some scholars, including the German Egyptologist Jan Assmann, who has spent much of his career on Akhenaten and his legacy, they have set the hymn inside a much larger story. Egyptian religious poetry, they point out, had been developing a universal vision of the sun god before Amarna, and continued to do so afterward. That wider tradition circulated in an Egypt that governed the land bridge to Asia for centuries. On this view, nothing was plagiarized. Something may have been inherited. The way a family resemblance passes down through generations who never met their great-grandparents. Other scholars look at the same evidence and see no connection at all. They point out that Egypt and ancient Israel were both farming societies living under the same sun, watching the same lions hunt at night and the same farmers walk out at dawn. Put any two poets in that world and ask them to praise a creator, and you may simply get similar poems, not because one copied the other, but because they were describing the same sunrise. Between those two positions lies a century of argument, and that argument is the real story of this video. So let us be clear about what we will and will not claim tonight. We will not tell you that the Bible copied Egypt. Nobody has produced the evidence such a claim would require, and you will see exactly what is missing. We will also not tell you the parallels are meaningless, because scholars who have spent their lives on these texts do not treat them as meaningless. What we will do is put both poems in front of you, passage by passage, using respected modern scholarship, including the standard English translation of the hymn by Miriam Lichtheim in her anthology of ancient Egyptian literature. We will show you where the texts genuinely echo each other, and where they sharply part ways, because the differences turn out to be just as revealing as the similarities, and we will walk through the main explanations, fairly, with names attached, so you can weigh them yourself. But before any of that can make sense, you need to meet the man behind the hymn, because the great hymn to the Aten did not come from nowhere. It came out of one of the most radical experiments in the history of religion, an experiment so extreme that the Egyptian state that followed tried to erase it from the official record. It began with a young king who was not supposed to change anything. His father had ruled a golden age. The temples were rich, the gods were many, and they were old, and they had always been there. Within a few years of taking the throne, this king would close temples, send workmen to chisel the name of Egypt's chief god off the walls, abandon the capital his ancestors had ruled from, and march his court into the empty desert to build a city for a single god. A god with no statue, no myth, and no face, just light. And when he died, his successors returned the favor. They struck his name from the king list so thoroughly that for 3,000 years the world did not know he had existed. His name was Akhenaten, and his story is where the record begins. Chapter 2. The Heretic King. Egypt, in the middle of the 14th century BC, was the superpower of the ancient world. Its empire reached from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. Gold flowed up the Nile in quantities that made foreign kings write begging letters, and several of those letters survive, complaining that the pharaoh has not sent enough. At the center of it all sat a pharaoh named Amenhotep III, who ruled for nearly 4 decades of relative peace and staggering wealth. Amenhotep III built on a scale Egypt had rarely seen. Temples, palaces, hundreds of statues. Much of that building honored Amun, the hidden god of Thebes, whose temple at Karnak had grown rich on centuries of royal donations. The priesthood that served Amun had become one of Egypt's great concentrations of wealth and institutional power, controlling estates, workshops, granadiers, and the labor of thousands. Kings gave to that temple because giving to it was how a king demonstrated piety, and every gift made the institution larger. Into this golden world, a second son was born. His name was Amenhotep. Like his father, the name means Amun is satisfied. We know very little about his childhood, and honesty requires saying so plainly. He appears in almost no monuments from his father's reign, and scholars have argued for a century about why. Some suggest he was kept in the background because he was not the heir. His older brother, a prince named Thutmose, held the titles of a crown prince and served in the priesthood of Ptah at Memphis. And then Thutmose disappears from the record. He most likely died young. There is a small, strangely moving object connected to him. A limestone sarcophagus made for a cat named Tamu, the lady, inscribed with the prince's name. It is one of the few traces we have of a young man whose death changed the religious history of the world, because it left his overlooked younger brother next in line for the richest throne on earth. When his father died, around 1353 BC, though Egyptologists still debate the exact year and the possibility of a co-regency between father and son, the young man was crowned as Amenhotep IV. For the first years of his reign, the surface of things looked ordinary. He was crowned at Thebes. He used traditional titles. He began building projects at Karnak, in the heart of Amun's own territory. But there were signs, even then, that something unusual was underway. His new buildings at Karnak were dedicated not to Amun but to the Aten, the physical disk of the sun. The Aten was not a new god. It had appeared in Egyptian texts for centuries as an aspect of the sun god Ra, and Amenhotep III had already shown interest in it, even naming his royal barge in the Aten's honor. So at first, this may have looked like an ordinary royal preference. Every pharaoh had favorite gods. What was not ordinary was the scale. Donald Redford, the Canadian Egyptologist who directed the Akhenaten temple project, spent years reconstructing these earliest buildings from thousands of scattered blocks. And his work revealed that the young king had thrown up an enormous complex east of the main Karnak temple, its walls covered with images of himself and his queen worshipping the disk. The new king was not quietly favoring a god. He was building on a scale that announced a program. Then, around the 5th year of his reign, The program became a revolution. The king changed his name. Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, became Akhenaten, which is usually translated as effective for the Aten, or one who is beneficial to the Aten. In Egypt, a royal name was not a label. It was a theological statement, carved on every monument, spoken in every official document. The king had publicly cut himself off from the God of his fathers, and he had done it in the God's own city, and he was only beginning. In the years that followed, work crews went out across Egypt with chisels. Their target was the name of Amun. They cut it out of temple walls, off statues, out of private inscriptions, sometimes climbing to reach it high on obelisks. In some cases they even chiseled out the plural word gods. They did not spare the king's own father, whose name, Amenhotep, contained the offending syllable. Redford has described this campaign as one of the most extraordinary acts of religious iconoclasm in Egyptian history, precisely because it was aimed not at foreign enemies, but at Egypt's own past. The great temples of Amun appear to have been closed or converted, their revenues redirected. The festivals that structured the Egyptian year, the great processions where ordinary people came closest to their gods, seem to have stopped in the places the crown controlled most tightly. Now, a necessary caution here, and it is the kind of caution this story usually does not get. It is tempting to say that an entire nation was ordered to forget everything it believed. The evidence does not support that picture, and archaeology has quietly complicated it. What we can document is a state program, driven from the throne, aimed at official religion, monuments, temples, and public cult. What people believed in their own houses is a different question. And the answer is more interesting. Excavations at the king's new city have turned up household objects connected with traditional household gods, protective figures like Bez and Taret, the deities ordinary Egyptians relied on for childbirth and safety, even in the capital of the revolution. In the shadow of the new temple, ordinary life kept some of its old furniture. So the correct statement is narrower and stronger than the dramatic one. Akhenaten's state closed the official channels to the old gods. It did not, and probably could not, reach into every home. What did he offer in their place? A single god, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, whose light touches everything alive. We should be careful with the label at this stage. Whether this amounts to monotheism in the sense we usually mean is a serious scholarly question, and it deserves its own chapter later. What can be said with confidence right now is this: Akhenaten's official religion concentrated worship on one god to a degree without precedent in Egypt, and it treated the other gods not merely as lesser, but as unwelcome enough to be erased from public view. The new god was strange in another way. The Aten had no statue in the ordinary sense. Egyptian gods were carved as men, as women, as falcons and lions and crocodiles. The Aten appears only as a disk in the sky, its rays ending in small human hands that reach down toward the king and his family, sometimes holding the hieroglyph for life to their lips. No myths were told about it in the surviving texts. It had no wife, no children, no enemies, no adventures. It did not die and rise like Osiris. It simply appeared each morning, and the world lived, and it set each evening, and the world went dark. If you want to understand the hymn we will read later, hold on to that image. A God who is nothing but light and presence. A God you cannot see face to face. only in what his light does to the world. There was one more feature of this system, and it may be the most important for our story. In Akhenaten's religion, as it appears in the surviving monuments, ordinary people did not approach the Aten directly. They approached through the king. The art of the period shows officials praying not to the disk, but to Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti, who pray to the Aten on everyone else's behalf. Texts from the tombs of those officials state the idea plainly. The god is known to his son. The king, the Aten, was lord of all creation. But he had, in effect, one authorized interpreter on earth. Remember that detail. When we place the hymn beside Psalm 104, the question of who is permitted to speak to God will become one of the sharpest differences between the two poems. By the 5th or 6th year of his reign, Akhenaten had a new name, a new god, and a court full of officials who owed their positions entirely to him. What he did not have was a home for his revolution. Thebes belonged to Amun. Every stone of it was soaked in the old religion. Memphis, the ancient administrative capitale, was crowded with temples to Ptah and a dozen other gods. So the king made a decision that still astonishes archaeologists. He would not reform an old city. He would build a new one, from nothing, on ground that belonged to no god at all. He found his site on the east bank of the Nile, roughly 200 miles north of Thebes, a great bay of desert ringed by cliffs, facing the sunrise. In the boundary inscriptions he cut into those cliffs. The king declared that the Aten himself had chosen the place, that it belonged to no god and no goddess, no ruler and no noblewoman. It was, he said, a blank page. He called the city Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today we call the site Amarna, and that is the name we will use from here, because it is the name under which the world knows it. In that city, on the wall of a nobleman's tomb, the poem at the center of our story was waiting to be written. Chapter 3. The City of the Sun. Most great cities grow slowly. They begin as villages, thicken into towns, and accumulate their temples and palaces over centuries. Amarna was different. It was willed into existence, almost overnight, by a single mind, and it is one of the very few ancient cities archaeologists can study as a single moment rather than a layered accumulation of centuries. The boundary stelae, the great inscriptions Akhenaten cut into the cliffs around the site, record his intentions in his own voice. He swore to build the city for the Aten and vowed not to extend its territory beyond the markers the god had appointed. 16 of these monuments have been identified around the plain, some of them enormous, carved with images of the royal family worshipping the disk. They are, in effect, the city's founding charter, and they are among the more unusual royal documents to survive from Egypt, because in them the king speaks with a fervor that reads less like routine state formula and more like personal conviction. Some Egyptologists take that at face value. Others suspect political calculation. A king removing himself from the reach of entrenched priesthoods in the old capitals. The stones themselves do not settle the question, and anyone who tells you otherwise is guessing. What the stones do tell us is how fast it happened. Construction seems to have begun around year 5 of the reign. By roughly year 9, the court, the government, and tens of thousands of people had moved in. Estimates of the population range from around 20,000 to 50,000, and the width of that range tells you something. This was a boom town, thrown up at speed. Builders used small standardized stone blocks, called talatat by modern scholars, light enough for one man to carry, which made walls rise with assembly line efficiency. Speed mattered more than permanence, which is an extraordinary thing to say about an Egyptian royal city. The city stretched for miles along a royal road running parallel to the river, and it followed the sun's logic. The great Aten temple stood at its heart, and it broke every rule of Egyptian temple design. Traditional temples grew darker as you moved inward, room by room, until you reached a small dark shrine where the god's image lived, hidden from all but a few priests. The Aten's temple inverted that. It was essentially open to the sky, a vast court filled with hundreds of offering tables, flooded with daylight. You did not descend into mystery to meet this god. You stood under the open sky, and he was simply there, above you, unavoidable. Around the temples spread the palaces, the government offices, the villas of officials with their gardens and grain silos, and behind them the packed houses of the workers, the bakers, the sculptors, the soldiers. And here we should meet one of the men who dug all this up, because the discovery of Amarna is itself part of why we can tell this story. In 1891, the English archaeologist Flinders Petrie arrived at the site with a young assistant and a method that was, for his time, radical. Petrie believed in recording ordinary things. Where earlier excavators had hunted for statues and gold, Petrie catalogued pottery, floor plans, glass, and rubbish, because rubbish tells you how people lived. He mapped the central city, uncovered painted pavements from a palace floor, and made the case that this abandoned plain was one of the most important sites in Egypt precisely because it had been used once and left. 2 decades later, in December of 1912, a German team under Ludwig Borchardt was digging in a residential quarter, in a house identified by inscriptions as belonging to a sculptor named Thutmose. In one room, buried in the debris, they found a painted limestone bust of Queen Nefertiti. It had been left behind when the city was abandoned, apparently as a studio model, and the dry sand had preserved the color as if it had been painted the week before. That face is now perhaps the most recognized image from the ancient world. And it exists only because a city died young and nobody came back for the furniture. Hold that thought, because it applies directly to our poem. Almost everything ancient Egypt produced was designed to last forever, and mostly did not. Amarna was thrown up for a single reign and abandoned, and precisely because of that, it preserved faces, houses, letters, and hymns that the rest of Egypt lost. Life in the city revolved around the royal family in a way that went beyond ordinary pharaoh worship. The art of the period, which scholars call the Amarna style, is unlike anything before or after. The king is shown with an elongated face, a slack belly, wide hips, and a long neck. Whether this reflects his actual appearance, a medical condition, or a deliberate theological statement about a body that transcends ordinary human form, is still debated. And we will not pretend the matter is settled. Medical theories in particular have been proposed and criticized for over a century, and the most recent scholarship tends toward caution. But the more striking innovation is intimacy. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are carved kissing their daughters, holding them on their laps, riding together in chariots, always beneath the disk, whose small hands reach down to them. The royal family had become the visible face of an invisible god. Their family life was, in a real sense, the new public liturgy, and the sun structured everything. When the disk rose over the eastern cliffs, the city woke, and worship began in the open courts. When it set, the city went dark. Death itself was reoriented. Instead of being buried on the west bank, the traditional side of the dead, the nobles of Amarna cut their tombs into the eastern cliffs, on the side of the sunrise. It is in those eastern tombs that our story narrows to a single wall. The officials of the new regime decorated their tomb chapels not with the traditional funerary texts, the spells and guides to the underworld that Egyptians had used for 1,000 years, but with scenes of the royal family and with hymns to the Aten. Several shorter versions of these hymns appear in a number of tombs, which is itself important, because it shows this was a shared court literature rather than one man's private poem. But the longest and most developed version, the text scholars call the Great Hymn to the Aten, survives in its fullest form in exactly one place. It is carved in columns of hieroglyphs in the tomb, prepared for a courtier named I. I is worth a moment, because his career is almost a story in itself. He held the title God's Father, and he may have been related to the royal family, possibly the father of Nefertiti. Though the evidence is circumstantial and scholars disagree, he survived Akhenaten. He survived the collapse of the whole experiment. He stood beside the boy king Tutankhamun as his senior advisor. And when Tutankhamun died young, A himself took the throne of Egypt as an old man. The tomb at Amarna that preserves our hymn was never used for his burial. He was buried elsewhere, in the Valley of the Kings, after the city was abandoned. Whether I composed the hymn, commissioned it, or simply had the court text carved in his tomb, we cannot say. Many Egyptologists suspect royal authorship, since the hymn is presented as the king's own address to his god, and ancient readers may well have assumed the same. But no author's name survives, and honesty requires leaving the question open. What we can say is this: when the city died, the text should have died with it. Amarna was abandoned within a few years of Akhenaten's death, around 1336 BC by most estimates, though the sequence of short reigns that followed him remains one of the most disputed puzzles in Egyptology. The court returned to the old capitals. The new kings dismantled the Aten temples, hauling away tens of thousands of talatat blocks to use as fill inside their own monuments. Which is, with some irony, exactly how so many of them survived for Redford's team to reassemble 3,000 years later. Akhenaten's name was hacked from monuments, just as he had once hacked out the name of Amun. Later, king lists skipped him, running straight from his father to the kings who came after the restoration, as if the years between had never happened. In one later text, a king refers to the period only by an oblique phrase, and Egyptian tradition remembered him, when it remembered him at all, as an enemy. The city emptied, sand drifted through the roofless temple of the sun, and in the cliffs to the east, in an unused tomb chapel, columns of hieroglyphs faced a doorway through which the light of the rising sun could still reach. Now, here is where we have to be careful, because this is exactly the point where storytelling likes to outrun the evidence. It is tempting to say that nobody read that wall for 3,000 years. We do not know that. We know almost nothing about who entered those tombs over the following centuries. Some were later reused by Coptic Christians, who left their own marks. Local people certainly knew the cliffs were there. What we can say, with precision, is something narrower and more useful. We have no surviving evidence that this text was copied, quoted, translated, or referred to anywhere outside Amarna. It does not appear in later Egyptian literature that has come down to us. It is not cited by ancient authors. It left no visible trail, and that distinction matters more than it may sound, because it is the hinge of the entire debate. A text that once existed in many copies and happened to survive in one place is a completely different historical object from a text that only ever existed in one place. We cannot tell, from a single surviving wall, which of those two situations we are in. What we can say is that the wall itself, the physical object in that tomb, is not a plausible source for a Hebrew poem written centuries later in another country. Whatever traveled from Egypt to the psalmist, if anything traveled at all, it was not this wall, which leaves the question wide open, and much more interesting. If not this wall, then what? We will come back to that. But you cannot judge a debate about a poem without hearing the poem. And the great hymn to the Aten is not merely evidence. It is one of the most remarkable things the ancient world produced. And it deserves to be heard for itself before anyone puts it on trial. Chapter 4. The hymn itself. Set the argument down for a while. Before this poem becomes a piece of evidence, let it be a poem. The great hymn, as carved in the tomb of Ai, fills several pages in modern translation. The standard English version most scholars cite is by Miriam Lichtheim, in the second volume of her ancient Egyptian literature, and that is the translation guiding our reading tonight. Other respected versions exist, notably by William Murnane and John Foster, and they differ in wording while agreeing on the poem's shape. What follows is that shape, in plain language, with the images as the hymn presents them. It opens at dawn. The disk rises on the eastern horizon, and the poem greets it as the beginning of all life. The opening lines pile up the god's beauty. He is great, dazzling, high above every land, and his rays embrace the countries he has made. And there is a striking idea right at the start. The god is far away, yet his rays are on the earth. He is present in every field and on every face, and at the same time unreachable. Distance and intimacy at once. That paradox runs through the entire poem. Then the hymn does something unexpected. Instead of staying in the light, it plunges into darkness. When the Aten sets in the western horizon, the poem says, the earth is in darkness as if in death, and the poet lingers there. Sleepers lie in their rooms, heads wrapped, unable to see one another. A thief could carry off everything under their heads, and they would not know it. And outside, the night belongs to the animals. Every lion comes out from its den. The hymn says, all the serpents bite. Darkness is not restful in this poem. It is the absence of the god, and the absence of the god is danger. Then dawn again, and the world resets. The earth grows bright when the disk rises. People wake, wash, dress, and lift their arms in praise. And then the whole land goes to its work. Cattle are content in their pasture. Trees and plants grow green. Birds fly up from their nests. And the poem describes their wings spread in praise of the god's spirit. Flocks leap on their feet. Everything that flies and settles comes alive because the light has returned. Ships sail north and sail south. The roads open, and fish in the river dart before the god's face. whose rays reach into the midst of the sea. Stop on that sequence and hold it. Night as the hour of lions. Dawn as the signal for people to go out to their labor. Birds, flocks, ships, fish. If those images sound faintly familiar to anyone raised on the Bible, keep that feeling. We will lay them beside Psalm 104 soon enough, and you will see precisely how far the resemblance runs and where it stops. For now, stay in Egypt, because the hymn now moves from the day's rhythm into something deeper, the mystery of life beginning. It marvels at conception and birth. The God creates the seed in men and makes the fluid in women, gives life to the son in the mother's body, and soothes him so that he does not weep. He is a nurse in the womb, giving breath to sustain what he has made. When the child comes out from the body on the day of his birth, the God opens his mouth completely and supplies his needs. Then, in one of the most tender passages in Egyptian literature, the poet turns to a chick inside an egg. The God gives breath inside the shell to give life to what he has made. When the chick has completed its time, it breaks out of the egg, comes out to announce its completion, and walks on its two legs. Pause on that. A court poet, in the middle of an official theological text, stopping to watch a chick hatch. Whether the writer stood over a nest himself or drew on imagery already available in the temple tradition, we cannot know, and it does not matter much. What matters is that Egyptian religious poetry had room for a hatching chick alongside the machinery of the cosmos, and that the poem's argument for its God is built out of small living things. From the egg, the hymn opens out to the whole earth and delivers its boldest theology. How manifold are your works, the poet exclaims, though they are hidden from sight. The line in Lichtheim's rendering has become the most quoted in the poem, and we will meet its biblical relative later. The hymn then calls the Aten the sole God beside whom there is no other, who made the earth as he wished, when he was alone, all people, cattle, and flocks, everything on earth that walks on legs, everything on high that flies with wings. All of it is his making, and he sets every person in his place and supplies their needs. Notice what just happened. The horizon of this poem is not Egypt. Traditional Egyptian hymns praised gods who favored Egypt against its enemies. This hymn names foreign lands as equal objects of the god's care. It observes, with something close to curiosity, that peoples differ in their skins and their speech because the god has distinguished them, and it praises him for giving a Nile in the underworld to Egypt, while for the foreign lands he set a Nile in the sky, which comes down to water their fields, rain as a Nile in the sky, so that even people far from the river may live. A universal God, providing for all nations, each in the way suited to it. In the 14th century BC, that was a genuinely striking thought. The hymn praises the god as maker of the seasons, of winter to cool the land and heat, that they may taste him, and as the one who made the far sky in order to rise in it and see everything he has made. The rhythm of rising and setting is the rhythm of the world coming alive and going still. Over and over, a small creation every morning, and then, near the end, the poem narrows sharply. After all that universal vision, all those nations and creatures, the hymn declares that no one knows the God except his Son. The king, Akhenaten, alone has been informed of his plans and his power. The world exists for the king to govern, and the poem closes with the Son, the king, and the queen at his side. bound in a relationship no one else shares. Modern readers often feel a small shock at that turn, like a wide window suddenly narrowing to a keyhole. The universal God turns out to have exactly one authorized point of contact on earth. But for Akhenaten's court, that was the point. The hymn is theology and constitution at once. One God in the sky, one king below, and no priesthood, no mythology, no rival channel in between. So what kind of God does this poem describe? Strip it down and the profile is clear. A creator who works through light. A sustainer who feeds every creature daily. A universal lord of all nations rather than a tribal champion. A God without myth, without family, without a face, known only through his effects on the living world. And a God whose absence, every night, the world experiences as a kind of death. Egyptologists have long pointed out that many of these ideas were not invented at Amarna. Hymns to Amun-Ra from earlier in the same dynasty already praise the sun god as a universal creator who made all peoples and cares for what he made. Jan Assmann, in particular, has traced the development of what he calls the new solar theology, a movement in Egyptian religious thought that was underway before Akhenaten and that continued in altered form afterward. What Amarna did was concentrate those ideas, strip away every other god, and give the result a voice of unusual power. That voice is the reason this text refused to stay buried. When Davies published the Amarna tomb inscriptions in the early 1900s and the translations followed, readers across Europe and America were startled to find, in the tomb of a forgotten courtier, a poem that felt at moments almost biblical. Rested said as much in print, and the comparison has never gone away since. But before we can make that comparison honestly, a larger question hangs over everything. When the hymn says the Aten is the sole god and there is no other, what exactly does that mean? Was this monotheism 7 centuries before the Hebrew prophets? Was Akhenaten, as some popular books have claimed, the true origin of the idea of one God? An idea that somehow reached Moses himself. A dying man in London believed exactly that, and wrote a book about it that scandalized his colleagues and never stopped selling. Chapter 5. Was Akhenaten the first monotheist? In 1939, an old man in exile in London published the most controversial book of his career. His name was Sigmund Freud. He had fled Vienna the year before. He was dying of cancer of the jaw, and the book was called Moses and Monotheism. In it, the founder of psychoanalysis proposed a reconstruction that still makes historians wince. Moses, Freud argued, was not a Hebrew at all but an Egyptian, a follower of Akhenaten's religion. When the Aten revolution collapsed and the old gods returned, this Egyptian Moses chose an enslaved foreign people, gave them Akhenaten's god, and led them out of Egypt. Freud went further, suggesting the people later killed their Egyptian leader and buried the memory, and that the buried memory shaped everything that followed. Essentially, no historian today accepts this reconstruction. It rests on speculation rather than evidence, and scholars have catalogued its problems for decades. Freud himself half admitted the difficulty, calling parts of his own argument by names no historian wants attached to their work. But the book matters for our story, for 2 reasons. First, it shows how quickly the idea traveled, within roughly 3 decades of the hymn becoming widely available in translation. The notion that biblical monotheism might trace back to Amarna had moved out of Egyptology and into the general intellectual atmosphere of the West. carried by one of the most famous minds alive. Second, it set the terms of a public argument that scholars have been correcting ever since. When people online today claim the Bible copied Egypt, they are downstream of a conversation Freud did not start, but did enormously amplify. So let us ask the question properly. Was Akhenaten a Monotheist? Start with the case for yes. The hymn calls the Aten the sole god beside whom there is no other. Akhenaten did not merely elevate one god while tolerating the rest, which earlier pharaohs had done with Amun and Ra. He closed or converted temples. He sent crews to erase the name of Amun, and sometimes the plural word gods, from monuments across the country. Erik Hornung, the Swiss Egyptologist, whose book Conceptions of God in Ancient Egypt remains a standard treatment of the subject, concluded that Akhenaten's mature religion does deserve the name monotheism, and that it represents the earliest documented case of its kind. On this reading, the older gods were not merely demoted, they were denied. Now the case for not so fast, which is where most current scholarship lives. First, the king and his family remained objects of devotion. Ordinary people at Amarna approach the god through the royal family, and household shrines from the city show the king and queen receiving offerings. If monotheism means worship directed to one god alone, then in practice Amarna presents something more complicated, a structure in which the disk, the king, and the queen occupy the space that devotion actually reached. Second, the Aten is not a person in the way the God of the Hebrew Bible is a person. In the surviving texts he issues no commands, makes no covenant, and speaks no words. He shines. Some scholars have therefore argued that Atenism is better described as a religion centered on the single visible source of life than as a relationship with a personal deity. Others push back, noting that the hymn's language of care and provision is deeply personal in tone. Third, there is a genuine technical dispute about what was being claimed. Scholars distinguish monotheism, the belief that only one God exists, from monolatry or henotheism, the worship of one God without denying that others exist. The Amarna evidence consists of hymns, monuments, and erasures rather than theological treatises, and it does not clearly settle which of these labels applies. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is the honest result of asking a modern question of ancient material that was never written to answer it. Donald Redford, who spent years excavating the earliest Aten buildings at Karnak, reached a notably harsh judgment. In his book Akhenaten, the Heretic King, he portrayed the pharaoh less as a spiritual pioneer than as an autocrat imposing a sterile creed from above. A religion with little to say about death and little comfort for ordinary people, which he saw as part of why it evaporated so quickly once the king was gone. Other Egyptologists find that portrait too severe. The disagreement is real and it is ongoing. Jan Assmann offers a reading that many find illuminating, though it too has critics. Assmann argues that something genuinely new appeared at Amarna. Not simply the elevation of one God, but the declaration that the others were false, an exclusive truth claim of a kind not previously documented. He has explored the consequences of that move across several books, and he treats Akhenaten as its first known instance. But, and this is essential for our story, Assmann does not treat biblical monotheism as a straightforward descendant of Amarna. He has written extensively about the debate over the Aten hymn and Psalm 104, and he is well aware that many scholars reject any direct dependence. Israelite exclusive worship of one God. In most modern reconstructions, developed through its own long history, with decisive phases during the period of the monarchy and around the catastrophe of the Babylonian exile in the 500s BC, two mountains can rise from the same landscape without one causing the other. And there is a final, humbling point that reframes the entire question. Most biblical scholars today reconstruct Israelite religion as something that developed over centuries, moving gradually from the worship of one God, among others, toward the insistence that only one exists. The Hebrew Bible itself preserves traces of that journey, in passages that assume other gods are real and in later passages that deny it, which means the interesting question was never, did Moses meet Atanism? It is whether any Egyptian images, phrases, or literary conventions fed into the long stream from which Israel's poetry eventually drew. That brings us at last to the other poem. It is time to meet Psalm 104 on its own ground, not as a suspect in a plagiarism case, but as what it is, one of the summits of Hebrew poetry, with its own world, its own history, and its own God. Chapter 6. Psalm 104. The other poem. Set the Egyptian hymn aside for a while. Clear Amarna out of your mind. Because the second poem in our story deserves to be met the way its first audience met it. On its own terms and in its own world. Somewhere in ancient Israel, a poet composed a song praising the God of his people as the maker and sustainer of the entire living world. That poem now stands as the 104th Psalm in the biblical book of Psalms, a collection of 150 songs and prayers assembled over centuries. And even readers who care nothing for the Egyptian question have long recognized this psalm as something exceptional. Commentators routinely rank it among the finest poems in the Hebrew Bible, and the biblical scholar Hermann Gunkel, whose work on the forms of the Psalms shaped the entire modern field, treated it as a supreme example of the hymn of praise. Here is its shape. The psalm opens with the poet calling on his own soul to bless the Lord, and immediately wraps God in light. God is clothed in splendor and majesty, wrapped in light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent, laying the beams of his chambers on the waters, making the clouds his chariot and riding on the wings of the wind. Notice that opening move, because it will matter enormously later. Light in this poem is not God. Light is what God wears. The distinction sounds small. It is not. The poem then unfolds as a tour of creation, but a tour with a plot. First, the cosmic architecture. God sets the earth on its foundations so that it will not be moved. The deep once covered it like a garment, waters standing above the mountains. At God's rebuke they fled. At the sound of his thunder they rushed away, running down the valleys to the place he appointed. And he set a boundary they may not pass, so that they will never again cover the earth. Scholars have long noted that this section draws on an old Near Eastern theme, the Creator subduing the unruly waters, a theme richly documented in Canaanite and Mesopotamian literature. Then the tamed waters turn kind. Springs gush in the valleys, running between the hills, giving drink to every wild animal, and the wild donkeys quench their thirst. Birds nest by the streams and sing among the branches. God waters the mountains from his chambers, and the earth is satisfied with the fruit of his work. He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for people to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the human heart, oil to make the face shine, and bread to strengthen the heart. The cedars of Lebanon, which God planted, drink their fill. Storks nest in the junipers. The high mountains belong to the wild goats, and the rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers, which is one of the few appearances of that modest animal in world literature. Then the poem turns to time. God made the moon to mark the seasons, and the sun knows its time for setting. And now listen closely, because this is the passage that stopped breasted a century ago. God makes darkness, and it is night. When all the animals of the forest come creeping out, the young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. The sun rises, and they withdraw and lie down in their dens. And man goes out to his work, and to his labor, until the evening. Night for the beasts, day for human work, and the sunrise as the hinge between them. Hold that sequence in your memory. You will hear its Egyptian relative soon. The poet then bursts into wonder at the sheer variety of the world. O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Then he turns to the sea, wide and vast, teeming with living things beyond number, small and great. There go the ships, and there is Leviathan, the great sea creature of Near Eastern tradition, which God formed. The Hebrew of this line is difficult, and translations divide. Some render it as Leviathan, formed to sport in the sea. Others take the sense to be that God formed Leviathan to play with. Either way, the theological effect is the same, and it is remarkable. In older Near Eastern literature, the sea monster is a threat to be defeated. Here it appears as one more creature inside the created order, not a rival to it. And then the Psalm's climax, the passage theologians return to again and again. All creatures look to God to give them their food in due season. When he gives to them, they gather it. When he opens his hand, they are filled with good things. When he hides his face, they are dismayed. When he takes away their breath, they die and return to their dust. And when he sends forth his spirit, or his breath. Since the Hebrew word ruach carries both senses, they are created, and he renews the face of the ground. Life in this poem is not a possession. It is a continuous gift, breathed out moment by moment, and every living thing is one withheld breath from dust. The psalm closes with the poet vowing to sing to God as long as he lives, hoping his meditation will be pleasing. And then, with one line that startles modern readers, a wish that sinners vanish from the earth and the wicked be no more. And finally, the last words, bless the Lord, O my soul, praise the Lord. Now, who wrote this, and when? Here, honesty requires slowing down, because this question sits at the center of our mystery, and it does not have a settled answer. The psalm carries no author's name and no date in the Hebrew text. Ancient tradition associated many psalms with King David, who would have lived around 1000 BC. And the Greek translation of the Psalms attaches David's name to this one, though the Hebrew does not. Modern scholarship generally treats the Psalter as a collection built up over a long period, from the era of the monarchy down into the centuries after the Babylonian exile. For this psalm specifically, proposals run across a wide range. Some scholars argue for a date during the monarchy, pointing to its deep links with older Canaanite poetic traditions and to language they consider archaic. Others place it during or after the exile. in the 500s BC or later, noting its close relationship with the creation account in Genesis chapter 1 and with the developed creation theology of that period. Many commentaries state plainly that the evidence does not permit certainty. Now do the arithmetic with me, because it matters. The great hymn was carved around 1340 BC, even on an early dating of the psalm. Several centuries separate the two poems. On a late dating, the gap grows considerably wider, whichever end of the range you prefer. No, the serious scholar suggests that the author of Psalm 104 stood in front of the wall in the tomb of Ai. One more thing about this poem before we set the two side by side. Psalm 104 does not float alone in the Hebrew Bible. Its sequence of creation, from waters to plants to animals to the heavenly lights, runs broadly parallel to the order in Genesis chapter 1, and scholars have debated for generations which text influenced which. Its themes reappear in the great speeches at the end of the book of Job, where God interrogates a human being about the wild goats and the lions and the rain that falls where no one lives. And it has a close cousin inside the Psalter itself, Psalm 19, which opens with the heavens declaring the glory of God and describes the sun coming out like a bridegroom, running its course with joy. That psalm is worth remembering, because it shows a Hebrew poet using vivid solar imagery without any suggestion of borrowing from Egypt. The imagery of the sun was available to anyone who looked up. In other words, this poem has a family, a native literary ecosystem. Any theory of Egyptian influence has to explain why we should reach across centuries to Amarna for what Hebrew literature might well have grown at home. And yet, when the two poems finally meet on the page, the resemblances are not nothing. They convinced a hard-headed Chicago Egyptologist that something connected them. They have kept scholars arguing for 100 years. You have now heard both poems separately, each in its own world. You know the Egyptian hymn rises and falls with the daily gift and terror of the sun. You know the Hebrew psalm clothes its God in light and holds every creature in his open hand. The moment has come to put them together and let you judge the echoes with your own ears. Chapter 7. Side by Side. This is the chapter everything has been building toward. So let us set the ground rules before we begin. The Egyptian material follows the standard scholarly translation by Miriam Lichtheim. The Hebrew follows the familiar wording of standard English Bibles, which for this psalm differ only in small details. We will take the strongest resemblances one at a time, in the order scholars usually discuss them, and after each one we will ask the only question that matters. Is this close enough to require a connection, or could two poets have arrived here independently? And one honest note before we start. Not all of these resemblances carry equal weight. Part of what has gone wrong in the viral version of this story is that every parallel gets presented at maximum strength, as if they were all equally decisive. They are not, and we will say so as we go. Begin with night and the lions. The hymn describes the world when the Aten sets. The earth lies in darkness as if in death. Sleepers, wrapped in their rooms, unseeing. Every lion comes out from its den, and the serpents bite. Darkness reigns while the maker of the world is below the horizon. The psalm says God makes darkness and it is night, when all the animals of the forest creep out, and the young lions roar after their prey, seeking their food from God. Both poems use nightfall the same way, as the hour when the human world withdraws and the predators inherit the earth, and both choose the lion as the emblem of that hour. This is the resemblance that first startled readers a century ago, and it remains one of the most discussed. But notice the difference already hiding inside it. In the hymn, night happens because the God is absent. In the psalm, God makes the darkness, and the lion's roar is itself a form of petition, seeking its food from God. One poem treats night as abandonment. The other treats it as a shift change inside a single unbroken government. Second, sunrise and human labor. The hymn says that when the disk rises, the land grows bright. People wake, wash, dress, raise their arms in praise, and then the entire land goes to its work. The psalm says the sun rises, the lions withdraw and lie down in their dens, and man goes out to his work and to his labor until the evening. The sequence is nearly identical, and it is the ordering, more than any particular phrase, that impresses scholars. Night, beasts, Davn, withdrawal of the beasts, humans out to their labor. Both poems place the sunrise as a border crossing between the animal shift and the human shift. Skeptics answer that this is simply how life worked in any pre-industrial society at that latitude, and that no poet needed a source to observe it. Hold both thoughts at once. This is among the strongest individual resemblances, and it also describes the most universally observable fact in the ancient world. Third, the exclamation at the abundance of creation. The hymn exclaims, in Lichtheim's rendering, "How manifold are your works," and goes on to call the Aten the sole God beside whom there is no other, who made the earth as he wished, when he was alone, with all people, herds, and flocks. The psalm exclaims, "O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures." Here the resemblance reaches the rhetorical gesture itself, the same gasp at variety, placed in both poems immediately after a catalogue of living things. Even scholars who are cautious about the whole comparison tend to acknowledge that this one is striking. And yet watch what each poem does in the very next breath. The hymn pivots to solitude. He made it all alone, and there is no other beside him. The psalm pivots to wisdom. He made them all in wisdom, a word that ties the poem into the entire Hebrew wisdom tradition, to Proverbs and Job, and the figure of wisdom present at creation. Same gasp, different theology attached to it. Fourth, the ships and the creatures of the water. The hymn describes the world under the risen sun. Ships fare north and fare south. The roads lie open, and fish in the river dart before the God's face, whose rays reach into the midst of the sea. The psalm turns to the sea, great and wide, teeming with creatures beyond number, small and great. There go the ships, and there is Leviathan. Ships and water creatures, side by side, in both poems. Inside a survey of creation, this one divides scholars more than the previous three. Some find the pairing too specific to be accidental. Others point out that any poet describing a great body of water will mention what floats on it and what swims in it, and that the two waters are not really the same water. The hymns is the Nile of riverboats and darting fish. The Psalms is the Mediterranean world of sea-going ships and Leviathan. Judge it for yourself. Fifth, provision in due season. The hymn praises the Aten who supplies the needs of everything he has made, who sets every person in his place, who provides food and counts out lifetimes. The psalm says all creatures look to God to give them their food in due season. And when he opens his hand, they are filled with good things. The shared conviction is that the Creator did not retire after creating, but keeps every stomach filled daily. This is a real theological kinship, and it is also, as skeptics rightly note, an idea found widely across ancient Near Eastern religious poetry, including Mesopotamian hymns with no Egyptian connection at all. It may mark a shared regional theology rather than a specific lone. Sixth, and here we lower the volume deliberately, breath and life and renewal. The hymn describes the God giving breath to the child in the womb and to the chick inside the shell, and describes the world lying as if dead each night until his rising makes it live again. The psalm says that when God hides his face, the creatures are dismayed. When he takes away their breath, they die and return to dust. And when he sends forth his breath, they are created, and the face of the ground is renewed. Both poems make life a daily loan of breath from the Creator, and both associate the god's withdrawal with a kind of death, but this is a broader thematic resemblance rather than a close textual one, and it deserves to be labeled as such. The verbal correspondence here is much looser than in the Lions and the Labour and the Manifold works, and the underlying scale is entirely different. In the hymn, the death and renewal are literal and daily, because the God literally departs every evening. In the psalm, God never sets, and his hiding is a metaphor of judgment and mercy rather than an astronomical event. Now, step back and take in the whole ledger, because the honest summary runs in two directions at once. On one side, the resemblances are real, and they cluster. Nearly all the strong echoes fall within one continuous stretch of Psalm 104. The passage running from the darkness and the lions, through the sunrise and human labor, to the exclamation at God's manifold works, and on to the sea and the food given in due season. And within that stretch, they appear in an order resembling the hymn's order. Scholars who defend some form of connection, in the line running from breasted onward, rest their case largely on this clustering, random resemblance. They argue, does not line up in sequence. On the other side, every single one of these resemblances involves something any attentive poet under the Near Eastern sun could observe with his own eyes. Lions at night, farmers at dawn, ships, fish, rain, breath, birth. Not one of them involves what scholars of literary borrowing consider the decisive evidence, an arbitrary detail that could not be reinvented independently. No rare word carried across, no unusual number, no proper name out of place, no copied mistake. And the psalm contains long stretches with no counterpart in the hymn at all. The waters of chaos rebuked and bounded, the wine and oil and bread, the cedars and stalks and rock badgers, Leviathan. The closest relatives of those passages live in Canaanite and Mesopotamian poetry, next door to Israel rather than across the desert. So the texts leave us precisely here. Too much resemblance to dismiss without thought, too little to convict without doubt. What we have not yet done is weigh the differences properly. And the differences between these two poems are not gaps or absences. They are two entire visions of God. And setting them beside each other may be the most revealing thing we do tonight. Chapter 8. The Differences That Matter. There is a rule of thumb in comparative scholarship worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Similarities catch the eye, but differences carry the information. Two texts can resemble each other for many reasons: borrowing, shared environment, coincidence, convention. But where two texts sharply diverge, They show you what each one actually cared about. So, before we ask how anything might have traveled from Egypt to Israel, let us ask a harder question. What did each poem refuse to say that the other one said? The answers cut deeper than any parallel. Start with the sun itself, because this difference is the largest object in the room, and it is easy to walk past. In the great hymn, the sun disk is the god. The Aten is not a symbol pointing towards something higher. He is the one addressed, praised in the second person, the beautiful one who rises on the horizon of the sky. Everything the poem says about creation and provision, it says about the disk overhead. Now watch what Psalm 104 does with the sun. The sun appears in exactly one role. God made the moon to mark the seasons, and the sun knows its time for setting. That is the whole of it. The sun in this psalm creates nothing, sustains nothing, and receives not one word of praise. It keeps a schedule that someone else wrote. Several biblical scholars have suggested that this handling may be deliberate, part of a wider pattern in Hebrew scripture of demoting the heavenly bodies that neighboring cultures worshipped. The opening chapter of Genesis makes a similar move when it declines to name the sun and moon at all, calling them simply the greater light and the lesser light. In a culture where those names were also the names of gods, whether or not the psalmist knew anything Egyptian, his poem systematically reduces the very thing the hymn worships. And remember the opening image we flagged in the last chapter. The psalm wraps God in light like a garment. Light is what this God wears, not what he is. The hymn's deity is, in the psalm's imagery, the wardrobe. It is difficult to state the theological distance more compactly than the two poems themselves do. Second, the night. We touch this in the parallels, but it deserves full weight. In the hymn, night is the god's absence. The world lies in darkness as if in death. Thieves could rob the sleeping. Lions rule the dark. The Aten has one great limitation, and every Egyptian could see it every evening. He goes away. The psalm's God does not go away. You make darkness, and it is night. The poet says, speaking directly to God, darkness is not an interruption of this God's reign. It is one of his working shifts, staffed by lions who seek their food from him. Elsewhere in the Psalter, another poet pushes the same thought to its limit, saying that even the darkness is not dark to God, that the night shines like the day. A God of the sun cannot survive the sunset. The God of Israel, whatever else he may be in these poems, is not a God of the sun. On this point, the two texts are not similar with variations. They are opposites wearing similar clothes. Third, the shape of time. The hymn has no creation story in the narrative sense. The Aten made all things. The poem says so repeatedly, but there is no sequence. No first act and second act. No account of how the world came to be. Creation in the hymn is happening now. It happens every morning. The poem's time is a circle. Dawn after dawn after dawn. The psalm has a plot. The waters once stood above the mountains. God rebuked them. They fled to the places he appointed. He set a boundary they may not cross again. That is an event, with a before and an after. And its closest relatives are the old Near Eastern accounts of a god subduing the unruly sea. Stories at home in Canaan and Mesopotamia rather than in Egypt. The Psalm's broad order of creation also tracks the order in Genesis chapter 1, its nearest structural relative in Hebrew literature. In other words, The skeleton of Psalm 104 is West Semitic. If anything, Egyptian is present in this poem. It is not the bones. Fourth, and this may be the difference ordinary listeners feel most immediately once it is pointed out. Who is permitted to speak to God? The great hymn ends by narrowing the universe to one man. No one knows the God except his Son. The King. The God's universal light funnels down to a single authorized channel, and every other person at Amarna approached the disk through the royal family. The hymn is magnificent, and it is also, structurally, a court document. Its theology and its politics are the same instrument. Psalm 104 has no king in it at all. Stop and let that register. A poem from the ancient Near East, produced in a world where kings put their names on everything, and there is no king in it. No temple, no priest, no sacrifice. The nation of Israel is not named. The speaker is simply a soul. Any soul. Bless the Lord. O my soul. The poem was preserved in a songbook used by an entire community, and any farmer, any widow, any child could sing every word of it as their own. The hymn's God has one interlocutor. The psalm's God has as many as there are voices to sing. Fifth, the moral dimension. The Aten of the hymn shines on everything and judges nothing. Nowhere in the poem does the God command, forbid, forgive, or condemn. He is cause and sustenance, not covenant. Some readers find this the hymn's serenity, a vision of a world simply given. Redford, as we have seen, found it closer to emptiness, a religion with little to say about human evil or human death. The psalm ends with a jolt that modern readers often find uncomfortable. May sinners vanish from the earth, and the wicked be no more. Whatever one makes of that closing wish, and commentators have wrestled with it for centuries. It reveals a God for whom creation is a moral order and not only a biological one. The psalmist cannot finish a poem about the natural world without raising the question of justice. The Egyptian poet never raises it. Add these differences up, and a clear picture emerges. If material descending from Egyptian solar hymnody did reach the author of Psalm 104, it was not simply reproduced, it was transformed, and transformed in a consistent direction. Every distinctly Atenist element, the divinity of the disk, the dead nights, the royal monopoly on access, is either absent from the psalm or reversed within it. That is why the crude internet version of this story fails. Copying produces reproduction. Whatever we are looking at here, if we are looking at anything, is something else. But now a caution, and it is one I want to be exact about, because it is the place where this kind of argument most often overreaches. It is tempting to say that the psalmist could not have reversed a theology he had never encountered, and therefore the reversals prove contact. That inference does not hold. A poem can contradict an idea its author never met. Hebrew poetry has its own long-standing reasons for demoting the sun and for insisting that its God rules the darkness, reasons that have nothing to do with Egypt, and Canaanite religion supplied plenty of local deities to argue with. The reversals are consistent with contact, they do not demonstrate it. The honest formulation is conditional. If these reversals were responses to Egyptian solar theology, then some form of contact would need to be explained. And that conditional is exactly why the next question cannot be avoided. Because contact, if it happened, happened somewhere, through some hands, some mouths, Some documents, not in the abstract, in the world, along roads that can be mapped and in cities that can be excavated. Scholars call this the transmission problem, and it is where a century of argument has always come to rest. Chapter 9. The Transmission Problem. In 1887, according to the accounts that reached European scholars, an Egyptian woman was digging for sebach, the decayed mud brick that farmers used as fertilizer, in the ruins at Amarna. In the debris she found clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped writing. Nobody local could read them. Some were reportedly damaged as they were carried around and sold, and the first dealers who saw them suspected forgeries, because nothing like them had ever come out of Egypt. They were not forgeries. They were the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian court, the archive of letters between the pharaoh and the kings and vassals of Western Asia, written in Akkadian, the international language of the age. Around 380 of these tablets and fragments are now known, scattered across museums in Berlin, London, Cairo, and elsewhere. They are called the Amarna letters, and they transformed the study of the late Bronze Age, because they let us hear the ancient Near East talking to itself. Hold on to that image, a farmer's hoe striking a diplomatic archive, because it is the perfect entry into our next question. Every theory of influence, however elegant, eventually has to answer something brutally practical. How, exactly, did anything get from there to here? Through what hands? Along what roads? Historians call this the problem of transmission, and in our case it comes with teeth. Let us lay out the obstacles honestly, because they are formidable, and any presentation that hides them is not being straight with you. The first obstacle is the state of the text. The fullest surviving version of the great hymn comes to us from a tomb chapel at a site that was abandoned within a few years of the king's death, in a city his successors dismantled. So far as the surviving record shows, this text was never copied into the wider Egyptian literary tradition that has come down to us. It is not quoted by later Egyptian writers, does not appear on papyri in the libraries of later ages, and leaves no visible trail outside Amarna. We cannot say how many copies once existed, and that uncertainty runs in both directions. But we can say that nothing in the surviving evidence puts this particular text in circulation. The second obstacle is time. Even on the earliest plausible dating of Psalm 104, several centuries separate the two poems, and on a later dating, the gap is considerably wider. To feel the size of that, consider that 5 centuries is roughly the distance between us and the first voyages across the Atlantic. Ideas can certainly travel such distances, but they do not travel by accident. They travel because someone copies, teaches, sings, or carries them. So the question becomes, what carried them? The third obstacle is language. The hymn is in Egyptian, in hieroglyphic script. The psalm is in Hebrew. We have no evidence of Hebrew translations of Egyptian religious poetry, and no reason to think Israelite poets read Egyptian religious inscriptions. Any transmission theory needs at least one bilingual bridge, a place and a class of people where Egyptian material could pass into a West Semitic language. State those 3 obstacles boldly, and the case appears closed. And if the claim on trial were, the psalmist read the great hymn to the Aten, the case would be closed. No serious scholar defends that claim. And we should say clearly that anyone presenting the split-screen image as proof of it is arguing for a position the field abandoned long ago. But that is not the claim serious defenders make. And here the story takes its most interesting turn. Because the great hymn did not appear out of nowhere, and the ideas it expresses did not vanish when the city was abandoned. This is the contribution of the wider Egyptological work on solar theology, particularly Assmann's. Sun hymns praising a creator who made all lands and sustains all life were being composed in Egypt before Akhenaten. Hymns to Amun-Ra from the same dynasty already speak of a God who made humanity and cares for what he made, who is present in the light, who provides for all creatures. Amarna took that developing language, stripped it of every other god, and pushed it to an extreme. And afterward, when the old gods were restored, the language did not simply disappear. Egyptian theologians did not rewind the clock. In the great hymns to Amun, preserved on papyri from the following period, including the famous Leiden hymn to Amun, we find a God described in sweeping universal terms, one who is present in all things, who made what exists, whose light fills the lands. Now safely reattached to the traditional god of Thebes and embedded in a theology of hiddenness and mystery that Amarna would have rejected. This matters, but we have to be careful about what it establishes, because it is easy to overstate. It does not solve the transmission problem. What it shows is narrower and still important. It shows that language broadly comparable to the Amarna material continued to exist within Egyptian religious literature, in texts that genuinely did circulate, on papyri, in temple libraries, in the hands of working scribes. In other words, a person in the centuries after Amarna did not need access to a sealed tomb chapel to encounter Egyptian poetry about a universal creator who sustains all life. Softer versions of those ideas were part of the living Egyptian tradition. That solves nothing about Israel. It only means the pool of possible Egyptian material is far larger than one wall. And that is a different debate from the one the internet is having. For anything to reach a Hebrew poet, the theory needs geography. And geography, for once, cooperates. Between Egypt and the people who would become Israel, there was no ocean and no wall. There was a land bridge, and during precisely the centuries after Amarna, Egypt governed it. From the campaigns of the 15th century BC through the Ramesside period, Canaan was Egyptian imperial territory. Egyptian garrisons and administrative buildings stood at Gaza, at Beth Shean, at Jaffa. Egyptian officials collected taxes and requisitioned labor. Egyptian scribes ran the correspondence, which brings us back to that farmer's hoe. Among those 380 tablets from Amarna are letters from the rulers of Canaanite towns, writing to the Egyptian court about raids, rivals, and requests for troops. One correspondent is a man named Abdi Heba, who ruled a hill town the letters call Urusalim, Jerusalem, centuries before David. Writing to the court of Akhenaten, that proves nothing whatsoever about poetry, and we should not pretend otherwise. What it does is collapse any picture of two sealed worlds. These worlds touched administratively, commercially, and culturally for centuries, and we have their mail. So the serious transmission hypothesis, stated carefully, sounds like this. Not, the psalmist read the hymn. Rather, that Egyptian solar hymnody of the broader kind that survived Amarna circulated within an empire that included Canaan. That local scribes, trained in a scribal culture shaped by Egyptian administration, absorbed images and conventions from it. that those images entered the poetic vocabulary of the region, and that centuries downstream, a Hebrew poet, praising his own God, reached for images that had long since been naturalized. No longer foreign, no longer solar, no longer royal. Simply the way one praised a creator. On this model, the resemblance between hymn and psalm is the resemblance of a great-grandparent to a descendant who never met them, connected by generations of carriers whose names are lost. It is a coherent theory. Scholars of standing find versions of it plausible. But notice what it requires. A chain with several links. Egyptian survival. Regional absorption. Hebrew inheritance, in which the middle links are, so far, largely undocumented. We can demonstrate that Egyptian solar hymns continued after Amarna. We can demonstrate Egyptian presence in Canaan for centuries. What no one has yet produced is the West Semitic poetry that would show the images making the crossing. The next step, then, is obvious. Walk out onto that bridge and inspect every plank that actually survives. Chapter 10. The Canaanite Bridge. Every disputed crossing deserves a site inspection. So, let us conduct one, and be honest at every step about which boards are solid, which are cracked, and which are simply not there. The question is narrow and concrete. What evidence survives that Egyptian religious and literary material crossed into the Semitic world that would eventually produce Hebrew poetry? The foundation is solid. For roughly 3 centuries of the late Bronze Age, Canaan sat inside the Egyptian Empire. Archaeologists have excavated Egyptian administrative buildings at Beth Shean, in the north of what would later be Israel, with Egyptian architecture, Egyptian pottery, and monumental stelae of the pharaohs Seti I and Ramesses II standing in a Canaanite town. Gaza served as a center of Egyptian administration. Officials collected grain, mustered labor, and maintained the roads. This was not occasional contact. It was generations of daily administration, and administration runs on scribes. The scribes are the second plank, and they are more interesting than they sound. Go back to the Amarna letters. They are written in Akkadian, but the Canaanite scribes who wrote them kept slipping. They inserted West Semitic words as glosses on Akkadian terms, bent the grammar toward their native speech, and left fingerprints all over the international language. Modern scholars mine those slips to reconstruct the earliest attested stage of the Canaanite language family, the family to which Hebrew belongs. The point for us is simple and important. Late Bronze Age Canaan possessed a professional class trained to move between languages and writing systems. Bilingual and trilingual minds existed exactly where our theory needs them, at exactly the right time. Third, Egyptian texts were physically present in the region. Hieroglyphic monuments stood on Canaanite soil. Egyptian scarabs, small stamp seals carrying divine names and royal formulas, have been found across the Levant by the thousand. And there is a detail from the Amarna archive itself that deserves attention. Among the diplomatic tablets, scholars identified pieces of Mesopotamian literature, fragments of myth and epic, apparently kept as training texts for scribes learning the international language. Think about what that means. In the chancery of Akhenaten's own city, foreign literature was being copied as a classroom exercise. Literature demonstrably traveled with the diplomatic mail of this era. The channels carried more than tax records. Now the fourth plank, and it is the strongest one. And it comes from an unexpected direction. Not Psalms, Proverbs, In 1923, the British Museum published an Egyptian text called The Instruction of Amenemope, a collection of moral teaching from the Ramesside period, arranged in numbered chapters and addressed from a father to a son. Within a year, scholars comparing it with the biblical book of Proverbs noticed something remarkable. A specific section of Proverbs, the passage beginning at chapter 22, verse 17, and running into chapter 24, tracks the Egyptian work closely in its opening appeal, in a series of specific sayings, in imagery, and in its ordering. The biblical passage even refers to 30 sayings, and the Egyptian text is arranged in 30 chapters. The majority position among biblical scholars today, stated in standard commentaries, is that this section of Proverbs draws on the Egyptian work, whether directly or through an intermediary. A minority argues for a common source or for influence running the other way, and the debate has genuine complications, but the mainstream view is well established, and its significance for our question is considerable. It establishes that Egyptian to Hebrew literary contact is historically possible, and that in this separate and better documented case, it is widely accepted. That is worth a great deal. It is also worth being precise about what it does not establish. Amenemope is not evidence for Psalm 104. Wisdom literature and hymnic poetry are different genres, traveling in different circles, and the Proverbs case is accepted precisely because it displays the arbitrary details that our psalm lacks. The shared numbering, the specific sayings, the sequence. We must not let the logic run away from us into one Egyptian text crossed. Therefore, this one probably did too. What Amenemope removes is the objection that such crossings were impossible. It does not tell us that this crossing happened. There is one more piece of the geography worth laying down, because it fixes the two peoples in the same frame. In 1896, Flinders Petrie, the same excavator who mapped Amarna, found a large granite stela at Thebes inscribed for the pharaoh Merneptah, dating to around 1207 BC. Near the end of its account of the king's campaigns, in a list of defeated peoples in Canaan, one name appears, written with the hieroglyphic marker for a people rather than a city or a land: Israel. It is the earliest known mention of Israel in any surviving text, and it comes from Egypt, roughly a century and a half after Amarna. The stela tells us nothing about poetry. What it tells us is that within a few generations of Akhenaten, a group called Israel existed in Canaan, in territory Egypt claimed and campaigned in, and that Egyptian scribes knew the name. The two ends of our story were, by then, in the same room. And now the fifth plank, the one that has to carry the actual weight. And here the boards thin out. To sustain the transmission theory, we would want West Semitic hymns from the Late Bronze or Early Iron Age that show Egyptian solar language being absorbed. The missing middle generation between Egyptian hymnody and Hebrew psalm. Do we have them? Largely, no. The great body of Canaanite religious poetry comes from Ugarit, a city on the Syrian coast destroyed around 1200 BC, and those tablets are a treasure. They illuminate the background of biblical poetry at hundreds of points. The storm god and his palace, the sea and the sea monster, the divine mountain, poetic forms that recur throughout the Psalms. But the sun deity in Ugaritic literature, the goddess Shapshu, plays a different role than a universal creator of the Egyptian kind. And scholars have not found in these texts the developed solar theology our bridge would need. There are hints elsewhere that keep the discussion alive. Egyptian-style solar motifs appear on Levantine seals and ivories. There are place names in Israel built on the word for sun, such as Beth Shemesh, House of the Sun, and there is a genuine and ongoing scholarly discussion about whether Israelite religion absorbed solar imagery for its own god. Drawing on passages in the Psalms and the prophets and on archaeological finds, these keep the theory breathing. They do not amount to a documented chain. So here is the inspection report, stated as precisely as we can. The infrastructure for transmission existed. Empire, scribes, bilingual, professionals, circulating texts, and demonstrable literary contact in at least one well-studied case. That infrastructure is archaeologically certain, and anyone who says these worlds were sealed off from each other is simply wrong. The specific transmission remains undocumented. The particular cargo we care about, solar hymn language moving from Egyptian poetry into West Semitic verse and downstream into Psalm 104, has left no surviving record of its passage. Advocates of influence reply, reasonably, that this is what we should expect, since almost no West Semitic literature from the crucial centuries survives at all, and an argument from silence carries little weight when the archive is nearly empty. Skeptics reply, also reasonably, that a theory which explains why its own evidence is missing is comfortable, and comfort is not proof. Both replies are fair, which means the moment has come to hand the floor entirely to the skeptics, because there is a rival explanation for everything we have heard tonight, one that requires no bridge at all. Chapter 11, or No Bridge at All. Try a small experiment in your own head. Take any poet from any century and place them in a pre-industrial land somewhere in the latitudes of Egypt or the Eastern Mediterranean. No electricity. Predators in the hills. Real ones. Both regions had lions in antiquity. Work done by daylight, because there is no other light worth working by. Now ask that poet to praise the creator of the world. What will the poem contain? Night will be dangerous in it. Because night was dangerous, the predators will own the darkness. Because they did. Dawn will arrive as a kind of rescue. And with dawn, people will go out to their fields, because that is what everyone the poet has ever known did every morning of their lives. If there is a river or a sea nearby, there will be ships on it and creatures under it. Rain will fall or fail. Babies will be born, and everything alive will need feeding every day from somewhere. You have just reconstructed most of the parallels from Chapter 7 without either ancient text in front of you. That, in one thought experiment, is the skeptical case. Scholars call it independent development, or convergence, and it deserves to be heard at full strength, because a fair hearing requires a real defense. The argument rests on three supports. The first is that the parallels are precisely the ones nature dictates. Go back through our ledger and notice the pattern. Every strong resemblance involves a universal, observable feature of life under that sun. Lions at night, farmers at dawn, ships and fish, food in season, breath as life. Not one involves what scholars of literary borrowing treat as decisive, the arbitrary detail that could not be reinvented. When one text genuinely depends on another, we usually catch it through oddities, a rare word carried across, a specific number, a copied error, a proper name that has no business being there. The Amenemope case in Proverbs, which we examined in the last chapter, contains exactly such fingerprints, and that is precisely why most scholars accept it. Psalm 104 contains no fingerprint of that kind, no Egyptian loanword at the key points, no solar theology, no royal mediator. The resemblances are all things two honest observers could see from two different hilltops. The second support is that the sequence may be nature's order rather than literature's. Defenders of influence lean heavily on the ordering night, then dawn, then human labor, then catalogue, then exclamation. But the skeptic asks a simple question. What other order is there? Night is followed by dawn everywhere on earth. A poet surveying creation lists creatures and then marvels at their number. Because marveling first and listing afterward makes no rhetorical sense. Some of what looks like literary dependence may be the plot of every day that has ever passed. When the source material is the sky, parallel poems are not evidence of contact. They are evidence of weather. The third support is that the Psalms' family tree is local. We saw this in chapter 8, and the skeptics press it hard. Every feature of Psalm 104 that is not a universal observation points away from Egypt. The waters rebuked and bounded belong to the West Semitic and Mesopotamian world of combat with the sea. Leviathan is a named creature of Canaanite tradition, appearing in the Ugaritic tablets centuries before the psalm. Wine, oil, and bread are the agricultural triad of the Mediterranean hills, not the products of the Egyptian countryside. The storks nest in junipers and the goats climb the crags because the poet is describing a landscape he can see. And the poem's architecture parallels Genesis chapter 1, its next of kin in Hebrew literature. Every structural bone in the poem, say the skeptics, is native. Why import a foreign ancestor to explain a resemblance the local family already accounts for? Put the three together, and the skeptical conclusion follows cleanly. Two agrarian societies, under the same sun, at similar latitudes, with comparable economies of field and flock, produce two creation hymns furnished with similar objects. No bridge required, because on this account there is no river to cross. Serious scholars hold essentially this position. Standard commentaries on the Psalms routinely note that the parallels, while striking, can be explained by the common stock of ancient Near Eastern hymnic tradition and shared human experience, without requiring direct or even indirect Egyptian influence. And a full-length modern study of Atenism and its supposed biblical connections concluded that comparative analysis does not demonstrate a direct connection between the Aten hymn and the psalm. On this reading, breasted, moved by a genuinely astonishing discovery, he saw a signal in what was largely the noise of two civilizations describing one world. So is that the end of it? Not quite. Because fairness cuts both ways, and the convergence argument has soft spots of its own. The first is that convergence explains the individual images better than it explains their concentration. It is one thing for lions, daven, ships, and provision to arise independently in two poems. It is another for nearly all the echoes to gather inside one continuous stretch of the psalm, in an order resembling the hymns, while the rest of the psalm sounds thoroughly West Semitic. A skeptic can answer this with nature's order again, and that answer has force. But the clustering is the one feature that keeps cautious scholars from closing the file. The second is that convergence is most persuasive when two worlds never touched. And these worlds touched. This is not a case of poets on separate continents. Egypt governed the land bridge for 3 centuries. Egyptian literature demonstrably entered the Hebrew Bible in at least one well-studied instance. Egyptian hymns using universal solar language circulated widely after Amarna. Independent invention remains entirely possible in such a world, but it is not the forced conclusion it would be between, say, Egypt and Peru, where contact is proven and materials are known to have moved. Treating every resemblance as coincidence is itself a substantial claim requiring its own defense. And there is a third possibility, which is neither of the 2 positions we have been weighing, and which some scholars find the most realistic of all. Perhaps the question, borrowing or coincidence, has always been too crude for the material. Perhaps what produced the resemblance was a whole regional environment, shared hymnic conventions across the ancient Near East, images passing anonymously through generations of scribes until no one owned them, a common stock of ways to praise a creator, plus the same sun over everything. On that account, there is no single road to find, because there was never a single road. That is not a compromise between the 2 theories. It is a different picture of how literary culture works. We should be careful not to announce that scholarship has settled on this third view. It has not. The field remains genuinely divided. And preserving that division honestly is part of what this video owes you. Which leaves us holding an unresolved question after a century of work. That might sound like failure. It is not. Because what this debate reveals about the texts, about the scholars, and about us, the people who keep sharing that split-screen image with the yellow highlights, may be worth more than any verdict. Chapter 12. What the Argument Reveals. We have spent 11 chapters on 2 poems, and if you have stayed with us this far, you may have noticed something curious about the shape of the journey. The evidence has been essentially stable for a century. The wall has not changed. The psalm has not changed. The parallels Breasted saw are the parallels you heard tonight. And yet the argument goes on, generation after generation, with an energy that philology alone cannot explain. When a scholarly question refuses to die for 100 years, the reason often lies partly in the people reading. So for one chapter, let us turn the lens around. Start with that split-screen image, the one with the yellow highlights, and ask a simple question about it. Why is it so satisfying to share? Part of the answer is the oldest pleasure on the internet. The sense of possessing hidden knowledge. They do not want you to know this. The image casts whoever shares it as someone who has looked behind a curtain, but there is a deeper pull underneath, and it is worth naming plainly. For some people, the image promises a weapon. If the Bible copied Egypt, then the Bible is derivative, and if it is derivative, its authority falls. One screenshot, and 3,000 years of scripture collapse. That is an enormous return on a very small investment of reading. Notice, though, the assumption buried inside that hope. The assumption is that a text with sources cannot be sacred, that origins determine worth. Philosophers call this style of reasoning the genetic fallacy, judging a thing by where it came from rather than by what it is. And here is the strange part. The most enthusiastic debunkers and the most anxious defenders in this argument frequently share that assumption. One side hopes the psalm borrowed in order to discredit it. The other fears the psalm borrowed, as though borrowing were contamination. Both sides agree, without ever saying so, that a poem's value lives in its pedigree. But should it? Consider what we actually found in chapter 8. If material descending from Egyptian solar hymnody reached the psalmist, he did not submit to it. He built something that reverses it at nearly every theological point, demoting its god to a timekeeper, dressing his own god in its light, staffing its terrifying night with obedient lions, and opening its royal monopoly to every singing soul. If that is theft, it is the kind in which the stolen object returns, transformed beyond its maker's imagination. Poets have a long history of such thefts, and literature would be far poorer without them. The interesting question about Psalm 104 was never where the images came from. It was always what the poet built with them. On that question, the yellow highlights have nothing whatever to say. There is a second thing this debate reveals, and it concerns the scholars. It is difficult not to notice how differently successive generations have framed the same evidence. Breasted, writing in the early 20th century, presented Amarna as a stage in the growth of ethical conscience, and titled his book accordingly. Freud, writing at the end of the 1930s, made the Egyptian origin of Moses into a story of buried and repressed memory. Redford, writing decades later, emphasized authoritarian imposition and the sterility of a state creed. Assmann has framed Amarna as the first appearance of an exclusive truth claim in religion and traced the long consequences of that idea. Now, we should be careful here. It would be easy, and it would be entertaining, to explain each of these framings by the anxieties of the era that produced it. That kind of explanation is a hypothesis about what was in a scholar's mind, and unless a scholar has told us, we do not know. What we can observe is the pattern itself, the same wall, the same columns of hieroglyphs, and four bodies of interpretation that emphasize different things. That observation does not make scholarship futile. Every one of these scholars also corrected real errors and added real knowledge. And the field today understands Amarna far better than it did in 1900. But it is a standing reminder that the past does not speak to us unaccompanied. We hear it in duet with our own questions, and knowing that is part of what separates history from propaganda. And that brings us to the last thing this case teaches, the one closest to the point of an evening like this. We began by contrasting our story with another Egypt copied it claim, the one about Jesus and Horus, which dissolves the moment you open the ancient sources. Tonight's case looked superficially identical, another split screen, another confident caption. But it turned out to be profoundly different, because this time the parallels were real, the scholars were serious, and the question remains genuinely open. Hold those two cases side by side, and you learn something useful about reading the internet. The same style of image, the same tone of certainty, can sit on top of pure fiction or on top of a real and unresolved scholarly debate, and nothing on the surface tells you which. The only way to know is to do what we have done tonight. Open the sources, read the whole texts, listen to the actual specialists on every side, and accept the answer, even when the answer is, we do not know. We do not know. After a century, the honest verdict on the hymn and the psalm is a suspended judgment, influence unproven, coincidence unproven, both sides holding real arguments, and neither able to land a final blow. Some find that unsatisfying. We would gently suggest the opposite. Certainty is cheap tonight. It is being manufactured by the million and shared before breakfast. Suspended judgment, held with full knowledge of the evidence, is the rarer and more valuable possession. But we cannot end on method alone. Because this story does not belong to the methodologists. It belongs to two poems, and to the strange fact that either of them reached us at all. Chapter 13. The sun still rises. Imagine the plain at Amarna. Sometime in the 12th century BC, a century or so after the city was abandoned. We have no record of such a morning. So, what follows is a picture, not a document, but everything in it is consistent with what the site tells us. A herdsman moves his animals along the base of the eastern cliffs in the early light. Around him, sand has drifted into the streets where chariots once ran. The great open temple is a field of broken stone, its blocks already being carried away for use elsewhere. The name of the king who built all this has been struck from the official records so thoroughly that the herdsman has very likely never heard it spoken. Above him, cut into the cliff face, the dark doorways of tombs that were never filled. Inside one of them, on a wall no one has come to see, a poem is speaking to an empty room. You rise beautiful on the horizon of the sky. Every lion comes out from its den. How manifold are your works! By every reasonable expectation, that text was finished. Its city was gone. Its god was out of favor. Its royal patron had been removed from memory, and it was carved on a wall in a place with no reason for anyone to visit. And yet, of the two futures available to it, oblivion and return, it somehow drew the second, not through faith, because no religion carried it forward, not through empire, because the empire had renounced it. It survived through stone and dry air, and the accident that a courtier's unused tomb chapel was not worth a chisel to the men sent out to erase a king. For most of the next 3,000 years, so far as the surviving record can tell us, that poem played no part in the intellectual life of the world. Then, in the 1800s, European scholars reached the cliffs with lamps and notebooks, and copied the columns. Davies published careful facsimiles in the early 1900s. Translations followed, and the hymn began to speak again, to readers in languages that did not exist when it was carved, on continents its author never imagined. Today it appears in anthologies beside Homer and the Psalms, and students who could not find Amarna on a map can quote its lines. The Psalms' survival is the opposite story in nearly every respect, and just as improbable, Psalm 104 never had the protection of silence. It lived in the open, in the most dangerous place a text can live, in continuous human use, copied by hand across centuries in which Jerusalem was besieged, burned, rebuilt, and burned again. It went into exile in Babylon and came back. It was translated into Greek in Alexandria, of all places, back in Egypt, where descendants of the Pharaoh's subjects now read Hebrew poetry in the Pharaoh's own land. It survived the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of our era, survived the scattering of the community that sang it, and passed into synagogues and monasteries, into Latin and Syriac and Slavonic, and eventually into 1,000 languages. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves above the Dead Sea, beginning in 1947, are manuscripts containing this psalm, roughly 2,000 years old. The words on that ancient material are recognizably the words being sung this week. Two poems, one preserved by being completely forgotten, the other by being continuously used. It is difficult to invent a neater illustration of the two ways the past reaches us, and perhaps That is the truest answer available to the question we have carried all night. Whether or not any thread of influence connects them. History has joined them now. They will be printed side by side and argued over side by side for as long as people read either one. Breasted's comparison, whatever its final verdict, gave each poem a permanent companion. The Internet's version of that companionship is a courtroom. It does not have to be. It can be a duet. And it is a duet you can still hear, because the subject of both poems has not changed. Every morning since Akhenaten's last morning, the sun has come up over the cliffs at Amarna, more than 1,000,000 dawns, lighting the doorways of tombs in a silent cliff face. And on every one of those mornings, somewhere, human beings have woken, washed, and gone out to their work. Exactly as both poets described, the lions of the world withdrawing, the fields filling with people, the birds lifting from the branches, every living thing waiting in its season to be fed. The pharaoh who staked everything on that sunrise lost his city, his cult, and even his place in the official memory of his own country, only to be recovered by history 3,000 years later. The unnamed Hebrew poet who gave the sunrise to his own god asked for nothing, left no signature, and received instead one of the longest unbroken audiences any poet has ever had. Somewhere tonight, in a language neither of them spoke, someone will read one of their poems and feel what they felt, that the world is enormous, that life arrives each day like a gift with no name attached, and that the only adequate response is wonder. The scholars will keep arguing, and they should. That is what honesty sounds like across generations. But the poems themselves have never argued. One says, "You rise beautiful on the horizon of the sky." The other says, "You are clothed with splendor and majesty, wrapped in light as with a garment." Two voices, more than 3,000 years old, still awake in the dark, still praising the light. The tomb is quiet now. The desert is cooling. The record has spoken. Sleep well.